So here we are, Marco Severino from Flow Design Architects. We're going to continue to chat about the video series, Understanding the Zoning Requirements. Last time in the video prior, we discussed and talk about the generic elements that we needed to understand in order to either develop an existing property or your home, or if you have an empty lot that you think that could be developed. We talk about the major elements. Now we're gonna zoom in and talk about specific points that are very important for you to be aware of and for you to understand when building inspectors talk to you and ask you certain things. Now you have a knowledgeable answer to be able to respond. So one of the major topics that we are gonna discuss today are the concept of zoning districts, which we briefly discussed it in the previous video, but we are also going to talk about the concept of setbacks and FAR and lot coverage. We're going to try to tackle those three concepts today. So what are setbacks? A lot of people ask us, oh, what is the setback for my, I live in Lynn. What is my setback in this district? I always tell clients, setbacks apply to every single zoning district for every locality or municipality or city or town. You need to be aware of which district you are located in order to understand what is your setback requirement that relate to that district in specific. So for example, if you are in a district that is R1, the setbacks that apply for that district might be very different than what applies in R2. So it's important for you to understand what those limitations and what those items are in order for you to have a knowledgeable information of what you can actually do. So the concept of setbacks, every city and every town want you to think about how they are developing the entire community as a whole. Sometimes our clients tend to, kind of zoom into their particular law. But I always tell them, like, think about what the city wants as a whole. So setbacks is a way to kind of control what the city will feel like in the future. Not just what it feels now, but how it will feel in the future. So concept of setbacks, it's how close of the property you can actually build. That's basically the main point. So as I mentioned before, every district is different. So for example, I already redrafted here what an example of setbacks is. So if you look at the red line, that indicates what your setbacks are in relationship to your property line. So for example, the darker line, that's your property. So this is your property. I don't know if we can see it. We can see it. And then the red line indicates your setbacks. Now, setbacks are one of those things that vary, as I mentioned before, depending on which district you are. So sometimes in this particular case, there is a 20-foot setback from the street. This is the street, and there is a 20 feet from setback. On the sides are 10 feet, and at the rear of the property are 20 feet. When we talk about setbacks, it relates also to which type of property you have. For example, if you have a law that has two streets, that language applies. For example, if you can see, let's say you have here we cannot really see. So concept of setbacks relate to your particular law. Every law is different. So the setbacks that apply to that particular law and conditions may vary. So for example, in this case, we have the street at the front of the property, but there might be another house here. So there is a house. There might be another house here. There might be a house at the front, at the back. This is what a typical condition. But what about if you have two fronts for the property? If you have a street at the front and a street at the back, then the concept of setbacks still apply differently on this law than what it applies on this law. For example, this setback, you will have 20 feet of setback here, and you will have 20 feet of setback at the front of the property. Why? Because you have two streets that are within your law. Another point that you should be aware of is the fact when there are lots that are cornered. For example, let me just erase this so you're able to see the difference. What about when you have a law that does this? Let's imagine that's a house. That's your law. But this entire thing is the street. And let's imagine that that's your law. In this case, you have, let's imagine that's a house. That's a house, a street. In this case, if you have 20-foot setback, now you cannot build within this entire portion of the law. This property over here, that will be considered your side setback. So in this case, it will be 10 feet. 10 feet. This is 20 feet. And then this will be considered your side setback. So that will be 10 feet. It's important for you to be aware that this determination of setbacks may vary depending on where you are located. So if you are in Newton, Massachusetts, might be different than if you are in Salem, Massachusetts. So it's important for you to read your zoning bylaws in order to understand how does the city deal with setbacks for different types of lots. Very, very important. So now that we understand what setbacks are, it's important that you are aware of the concept of FAR and lot coverage, which are very different topics. So FAR, or floor area ratio. So not only you have to understand the concept of setbacks and how close to your property you can build, but you need to also be aware of your floor area ratio. How big can I actually build within my lot? And also the concept of lot coverage, which we're gonna specify this in depth shortly. So now let's dip into the concept of FAR, of floor area ratio. First, I always suggest clients, and we always as an office suggest clients to get a survey of their property done by a licensed survey, or sometimes civil engineers also create surveys of the properties. So you understand how big legally my lot is. So in this particular case, if we look back at our board here, I already drafted a law indicating that this site is 1,000 square feet. Very important that you understand what is your site, the size of your site. In this case, it's 1,000 square feet. On that note, it's important that you look back at your zoning requirements, because sometimes lots are smaller when they are required by the city. So for example, if you have a law that is 1,000 square feet, but the city in the district that you are, let's say you are in district R1, the minimum for a single family is a law of 2,000 square feet. That means that you will have to go through a special permit in order to approve whatever you are trying to accommodate within the law that you currently have. Those are things that we always tell clients, like, what is the minimum, what is the site, how big is your site? And then we look and do a zoning review of that law and realize, like, oh wow, wait, your minimum is actually 2,000 square feet. So you cannot build a house by right, meaning that you can just show the permit set of drawings to the town and then get it approved and start building. You need to go through a special permit in order to, for the city to allow you to grant you a variance that the law minimum size requirement does not comply, and then you can actually start building. So very, very important. We always testify and tell people, like, you need to be aware of what are your requirements with your zoning requirements and your bylaws of wherever you are located. Very, very important. I tell people and always keep reminding people to be aware of these concepts, so that you can actually have an informative decision to even if you are going to buy a lot and you notice that this law is 1,000 square feet and you are trying to, and you really like it, but then you go into your bylaws and realize, oh my God, the minimum is 2,000 square feet. So, oh, now I have to go through a special permit in order to approve whatever I am trying to do. Versus if you find a law that is 4,000 square feet, you can say, oh, I comply with my minimum requirement of 2,000 square feet. And you could actually say, oh my God, I could actually convert this into 2 units because I comply with my minimum law requirements. So this law that you are thinking of trying to get, if it is 4,000 square feet and you know the minimum is 2,000, you can say, oh, I can legally subdivide this in 2. So then you have 2 lots of 2,000 square feet each. Very important that you understand what the minimum requirements are in terms of the law, FAR, and lot coverage. So going back to FAR, floor area ratio. Now that we understand how big your lot is or needs to be, in this case, let's start erasing this. So we go to the board. In this particular town, just an example, this lot is 1,000 square feet. So if we go back to the concept of FAR, or floor area ratio, in this district, the FAR is 0.7, which means that what I can build in my property is 700 square feet. Do not get confused with lot coverage and FAR. Lot coverage means how much of your lot you can cover. So in other words, the lot coverage requirement here is 60%, which is 600 square feet. So in other words, if I have a house that is 20 by 30, that equals to 600 square feet. I comply with this requirement. So it's important that you understand the concept of FAR and the difference between lot coverage, because FAR relates to the law. in how big this building could be. So for example, if we have a site that is 1,000 square feet, if I have a house that is 20 by 30, that means it's 600 square feet. That's the footprint within my law. So I comply with the maximum requirement that is 60% of my law can be covered, which is 600 square feet. So if I have a 20 by 30, that equals to 600 square feet. So I comply with my coverage, law coverage. Now, FAR equals to 1.0, which means that if you have a lot that is 1,000 square feet, you can build 1,000 square feet of area. Now, it's important that you understand what that is. So if we go back to the board, I did a section here. Many towns and cities do not count the basement as part of the FAR calculation. So in other words, if you have a 20 by 30 house as the footprint of the house, that equals 600 square feet. Let's imagine you have 600 square feet on the first floor, but you want to do a second floor to this house. Let's say you match the same footprint of the house, and the second floor is also 600 square feet. And let's say the attic, you are gonna finish 50% of the attic, so that will be 300 square feet. The total of this is equal to 1,500 square feet, because you are not adding the basement. Many towns don't include the basement as living area or as an area that is calculated within the FAR. But that's something that you need to go back into bylaws, in your bylaws, to understand if the city actually count the basements and attics within that calculation. It's very important that you are aware of this, because if you try to do a 600 square feet in the first and second floor and finish also a portion of the attic, which equals to 1,500 square feet, now you don't comply with the FAR, which is 1.0, which equals to 1,000 square feet. So what would you do in that situation? Very simple. You could either eliminate or reduce the area that you are actually gonna do. So in this case, instead of doing a 20 by 30 house, you could do a 20 by 20 house. So that will be 400 square feet. 400 square feet, then 400. And then let's say the attic is 200, half of that. That means that you are at 1,000 square feet, which complies with your 1.0, 1,000 square feet requirement for FAR. So those are things that you need to be aware of in order to understand what your limitations are. Because now this is how we as designers and architects come up with how big the house needs to be in order to comply with these requirements. Very important. Now let's go over the concept of lot coverage. I briefly went over in this particular example, the lot coverage is 60% in this district, which equals to 600 square feet. What happens if you want to do a detached garage, or you want to do a shed, or you want to do something else within your law? That's when the lot coverage applies. So for example, let's imagine we're using the same lot here, and your house is 20 by 30. That means it's 600 square feet. It does not complies to your lot coverage, but if you wanted to do a detached garage, you wouldn't be able to do it, because then it wouldn't be able to comply within that 60% lot coverage. So what you could do is reduce the size of the house in order to allow you to do other things within that lot. So in other words, if you have, this is basically the same law, smaller. Let's say you do a house that is 20 by 20. That equals 400 square feet. And then you want to do a shed that still comply within your setbacks. Oh, that's a good point. If you do areas that are not livable, like garages, sheds, you need to look back into your bylaws because the setbacks might be different at that particular, with that particular use of that building. So for a house, the setback might be 20, but for a garage, the setback might be 10 or might be 5, depending on where you are located. So it's very important that you are familiar with this as well. So if your house is 20 by 20, you have 400 square feet of area, and your maximum is 600 square feet. That means that you can build a garage or a space that is 10 by 20. 10 by 20, which then equals to 200 square feet. And then that equals to what your law coverage or your max coverage area actually is. So as a designer and as someone that always deal with projects and properties, this is the kind of concepts and ideas that we relate to in order to understand what is actually possible within each law. So I hope that this video is helpful, and any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.